It was an unusually bright morning in St. Mary Mead, the kind of morning that made the curtains look whiter, the gardens livelier, and even the gossip seem somehow more polite. The vicar's wife had declared it perfect weather for the ladies' knitting circle, and as such, the parish hall was already humming by 10:30. Tea was poured, wool was sorted, and Mrs. Bantry was already recounting her version of the latest scandal involving the grocer's new assistant, who, it was said, came from London. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, had her needles clicking at a steady rhythm, her eyes soft but unerringly observant. To the casual eye, she was focused entirely on her lacework. In truth, she noticed everything. The tremor in Mrs. Price Ridley's hand as she poured milk, the way young Dorothy Craven avoided the gaze of everyone when the subject of the local constable was mentioned, and the faint, nervous laugh that followed Mrs. Hewitt's every sentence. The knitting circle was less about knitting and more about knowing, about who visited whom, what was said, and what was not. It was a social web delicately maintained, each stitch of conversation woven with quiet judgment. But today, there was something off. A faint ripple of unease seemed to flutter through the group, as if everyone sensed an absence, but no one dared to name it. "Has anyone seen Mrs. Bartlett?" asked Mrs. Bantry suddenly, her voice pitched just slightly higher than usual. "She's never missed a Thursday." A few murmurs followed. Someone thought she might have gone to visit her sister in Eastbourne. Another said she'd been seen near the post office the previous afternoon, carrying a rather large envelope. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment, only long enough to tie a mental knot around that particular piece of information. The vicar's wife, attempting to keep the air light, said perhaps Mrs. Bartlett had simply overslept, but everyone knew Mrs. Bartlett did not oversleep. She was punctual to the minute, and if she were ill, someone would have known by now. Still, they carried on, or pretended to. The chatter grew thinner, and the cheerful clatter of teacups could not quite disguise the discomfort that had settled like a faint mist in the room. It was 11:30 when the door opened, and Sergeant Hayes appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, and visibly out of place among lace and teacups. His cap was in his hand, his face unusually grave. He nodded briefly to the vicar's wife before addressing the room. "Ladies," he began, his voice low, "I'm afraid I bring some unfortunate news. Mrs. Bartlett has been found—" He hesitated, clearing his throat. "She's been found dead in her home." The silence that followed was nearly physical, a kind of stunned vacuum into which not a single breath dared to enter. Miss Marple alone did not gasp or clutch at her knitting. She looked down at the neat rows of her pattern and murmured, "Dear me," as though speaking to the lace itself. "How dreadful!" exclaimed Mrs. Bantry, already half rising. "Do you mean an accident?" "Unclear at the moment," said Hayes. "Dr. Haydock's there now. It looks unusual, to say the least. No sign of a break-in, and nothing seems stolen." Unusual. It was a word Miss Marple did not like in the mouths of policemen. It usually meant something human, not mechanical. Had gone wrong. "Unusual," she repeated softly, as if testing the word against her knitting. "And no one heard a thing, I suppose?" Hayes shook his head. "Neighbors say they didn't, but she was last seen yesterday evening, around 6. Miss Marple's gaze lifted then, calm, almost apologetic, and found Dorothy Craven's face. The girl looked pale, her hands twisting the wool too tightly, snapping a thread without noticing. Mrs. Hewitt placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering something meant to soothe. But Miss Marple saw what the others did not. Dorothy's eyes were fixed not on Hayes, not on the wool, but on the half-empty chair where Mrs. Bartlett usually sat. By noon, the knitting circle had quietly disbanded. Cups were emptied, wool gathered, and goodbyes exchanged in hushed tones. The sign outside the parish hall, Thursday knitting circle, 10 a.m. fluttered slightly in the autumn breeze. Someone, Miss Marple did not notice who, turned it face down as they left. Back in her little house on the high street, Miss Marple placed her knitting basket neatly by the armchair and poured herself a cup of tea. She sat in silence for a while, watching the steam curl upward. The village would be buzzing by evening, she knew. There would be speculation about poisons, intruders, even ghosts. But gossip, though amusing, had never solved a murder. She leaned back, eyes half closed, remembering the way Mrs. Bartlett had once said she never trusted the post. "Too many hands in between," the woman had murmured, winding wool. "Letters have a way of going astray." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Letters, envelopes, and a woman found dead, and on the very morning she was to lead the knitting circle. Outside, a bicycle bell rang faintly as the grocer's boy passed by. Ordinary sounds of village life, unbroken, unchanged. And yet Miss Marple knew that by tomorrow, nothing in St. Mary Mead would be quite as ordinary again. She set her cup down with care. "Unusual," she said again softly. "Yes, indeed." And with that, she reached for her knitting once more, the soft click of the needles marking the beginning of another quiet inquiry, one that would, as always, reveal far more than anyone in the village wished to see. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had transformed into a small theatre of whispers. Curtains that had once fluttered lazily in the autumn breeze now hid faces eager to glimpse who was walking past whose gate. The post office queue was longer than usual, and letters took twice as long to be stamped, for each envelope seemed to invite speculation. Miss Hartnell declared she had seen a strange figure near Mrs. Bartlett's cottage the night before the murder, or perhaps it had been a shadow. Colonel Melchett insisted it must have been some vagrant. No respectable villager would commit such a thing. Mrs. Bantry, meanwhile, told anyone who would listen that Mrs. Bartlett had received a mysterious letter 2 days earlier, and she looked quite pale about it, I assure you. Miss Marple listened to all of it with quiet interest as she sat by the fire that morning, knitting half forgotten in her lap. Gossip, she knew, was rarely accurate, but it often concealed small truths, tangled within exaggeration. It was, as she liked to say, a sort of tapestry woven by emotion rather than fact. By mid-afternoon, she decided to take her usual walk toward the high street, which, quite coincidentally, curved past Mrs. Bartlett's house. The cottage, a tidy little place with ivy climbing up the walls, stood unnaturally silent. A uniformed constable was stationed by the gate, his expression somewhere between pride and discomfort. He touched his cap when he saw her. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." "Good afternoon, Mr. Sims," she replied pleasantly, pausing to adjust her shawl. "A sad business, isn't it? I do hope poor Mrs. Bartlett didn't suffer." The constable shuffled. "Wouldn't know, ma'am. Doctor says it was quick. Poison, they think. Teacup on the table, half drunk." "Poison." Miss Marple's tone was mild, though her eyes sharpened slightly. "Oh dear, that sounds rather deliberate, doesn't it? Tea is so very personal. One rarely takes it from strangers." Sims seemed relieved to have someone sensible to talk to. "Well, that's just it, ma'am. No sign of anyone visiting. Everything locked up proper. Door bolted from the inside, window latch unbroken. Only her and the cat." "How extraordinary," murmured Miss Marple. "And yet someone must have brought the poison. Unless, of course, it came in another form. A letter, perhaps." Sims looked startled. "A letter? Oh, nothing of consequence," she said quickly, smiling in that vague, grandmotherly way that always disarmed policemen. "I only thought she did often write to her sister, didn't she? And there are so many curious substances these days, powders and tonics sent by post." She thanked him kindly and went on her way, leaving Sims frowning after her. At the greengrocer's, she met Mrs. Price Ridley, who was already armed with the latest rumor. "They say it was cyanide," she whispered conspiratorially, leaning too close to the apples. Hidden in the sugar bowl of all things. Can you imagine? Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Cyanide is such a dramatic choice, don't you think, and terribly bitter. One would taste it at once, unless, of course, there was something stronger to disguise it. Lemon, perhaps, or certain herbal teas. Mrs. Price Ridley looked both horrified and impressed. My word, Miss Marple, you do think of everything. Only of human nature, my dear, Miss Marple replied gently. And human nature, I'm afraid, is very rarely as clever as it believes itself to be. By evening, the village had worn itself into exhaustion. Theories abounded, from jealous lovers to misdelivered letters, but no one seemed closer to truth than before. The vicar had said a few words at supper about sin finding its own punishment, and Mrs. Bantry had sworn she would never touch tea again unless she brewed it herself. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly by her lamp, reviewing what little she knew. Mrs. Bartlett had received a letter. She had looked pale afterward. She had made herself tea, or perhaps someone else had made it for her. The door was bolted from the inside, which meant the killer had either known how to stage the scene or never needed to leave. She thought of Dorothy Craven, the shy young girl from the knitting circle, who had snapped her thread when Sergeant Hayes announced the death. Dorothy had seemed frightened. But frightened of what? The police? The gossip? Or perhaps of something she knew would come next? Miss Marple decided she would pay the Cravens a visit the following afternoon. She would bring a jar of quince jam, as was her custom, and inquire gently about the poor girl's nerves. People often revealed more over jam and tea than they ever would under oath. As she extinguished her lamp that night, the faint sound of rain began tapping at the window pane. The village lay hushed beneath it, yet somewhere in the distance a door creaked, and a dog barked twice, short, sharp, uncertain. Miss Marple, half drowsing, thought absently of envelopes, bitter tea, and the delicate fragility of human conscience. By morning, the rain had stopped. The road was still glistening, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth. She dressed in her neat grey coat, pinned her hat with precision, and stepped outside with her walking stick. There was no rush in her step, no expression of purpose, just the quiet determination of a woman who had long since learned that truth hides best where people least expect to find it. And as she walked toward the Craven cottage, past the hedgerows and the gossiping sparrows, the village clock struck 10, the very hour when, only yesterday, the knitting circle had begun. It seemed to her that St. Mary Mead itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next stitch in a pattern it could no longer quite see. The Craven cottage stood at the far end of Mill Lane, where the hedgerows thickened and the road turned narrow enough for only one cart at a time. Miss Marple approached with her usual unhurried gait, pausing briefly to admire the marigolds lining the path, though her mind was already weaving quiet threads together. She noticed the curtains drawn halfway, as though someone inside wished to see without being seen. Dorothy herself opened the door, her face pale and her eyes ringed with the telltale shadow of sleeplessness. She seemed startled at first, then visibly relieved when she saw who it was. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Mother's lying down. She's had a dreadful headache since yesterday." "I'm so sorry to hear that, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly, holding up her small basket. "I've brought some quince jam. Good for the nerves, they say. I thought perhaps you might fancy a little with tea." Dorothy hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. The sitting room was tidy but airless, as if the windows had not been opened all morning. On the mantelpiece stood a small clock ticking unevenly, and beside it a porcelain cat missing one ear. The kind of detail that told Miss Marple more than words, that something had been broken recently, and in haste. She took a seat by the window while Dorothy busied herself with the teapot. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she poured the water. "You've been quite the talk of the village, I'm afraid," Miss Marple said gently. Everyone thinks you were very brave to stay on at the knitting circle yesterday after such news." Dorothy's eyes flickered downward. "I didn't know what to do. Everyone was looking at me, and I felt sick. Mrs. Bartlett was always kind to me." "Indeed, she was a kind woman," Miss Marple replied. "I remember she helped your mother with the church bazaar last summer, didn't she? Lent her that silver tray." Dorothy nodded, then bit her lip. She was going to give it back soon, only she said she'd lost the cloth that went with it. She felt awful about it." "How thoughtful of her," Miss Marple murmured, though her mind seized on that one small inconsistency. Mrs. Bartlett, by all accounts, was meticulous. It was not like her to lose anything, especially not something borrowed. Dorothy sat opposite her now, clutching her teacup. "They say it was poison," she whispered. "The police came last night to ask questions. They said it might have been in her tea, but she always made it the same way. Always." "Habits are difficult to change," said Miss Marple softly. "And yet, sometimes a person changes one little thing. A new tea brand, a different sugar, a dash of lemon, and everything alters." Dorothy looked at her, puzzled, as if uncertain whether to answer. Miss Marple smiled kindly and let the silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to loosen the girl's restraint. "She got a letter," Dorothy said at last, lowering her voice. "The day before she died. I saw it. I was delivering some wool from the shop, and it was on her table, half open. The paper looked strange. Thick, yellowish, like something old. She was reading it when I came in. She hid it, quickly. Did she seem upset? More? Frightened, I think." Dorothy's voice faltered. "She told me not to mention it. Said it was family business, but she hasn't any family left, not that anyone knows." Miss Marple's needles might as well have been clicking in her mind. Family business, a letter on thick yellowish paper, poison in the tea, a missing cloth, threads, all of them, but still tangled. When she rose to leave, Dorothy followed her to the door. The girl hesitated before speaking again. "Miss Marple, do you think someone killed her? I mean, truly." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves carefully. "My dear, I think people rarely set out to do dreadful things, but they do them all the same when they believe they have no choice." Dorothy's lips parted slightly, as though she wished to say more, but then she only nodded. As Miss Marple walked back down the lane, the village bells began to toll noon, and with each note she felt the story deepen, not in drama, but in silence. She turned toward the high street where she expected to meet Sergeant Hayes. He was standing outside the post office, notebook in hand, questioning the postmistress, Mrs. Finch, who looked flustered and eager to please. "Ah, Miss Marple." Hayes greeted her with the faint air of a man both respectful and wary. "Just gathering a few details. Seems Mrs. Bartlett did receive a letter, as you mentioned yesterday. Posted locally, though, no foreign stamp." "Locally?" Miss Marple repeated. "How very interesting. And hand-delivered, perhaps?" "Could be," said Hayes. "No return address either. We're looking into the handwriting." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Oh, handwriting tells such fascinating things about people, don't you think? Especially when they try too hard to disguise it." The sergeant frowned slightly. "You think it was disguised, don't you?" He said nothing, only made a note. Miss Marple walked away slowly, her mind alive with quiet speculation. Someone in the village had sent that letter. Someone who knew Mrs. Bartlett's habits well enough to place poison in something she trusted. And someone who had a reason, not of greed, perhaps, but of fear. The air smelled faintly of rain and coal smoke, and a cart rattled by toward the market. Ordinary sounds, ordinary sights. Yet behind them, a pattern was beginning to take shape. Miss Marple knew it well, the faint tightening of invisible strings, the calm before revelation begins to whisper. And somewhere, she thought, watching the smoke curl above the rooftops. The person who had sealed that letter was already waiting, hoping, perhaps, that the knitting circle's silence would hold just a little longer. That evening, the lamps in St. Mary Mead glowed faintly against the mist that had rolled in from the meadows. The streets were near empty, and even the usual chatter from the pub had softened to a few muffled voices. Miss Marple sat by her window, a single lamp lighting her knitting, though her eyes were on the fog rather than the wool. She had spent much of the afternoon considering Sergeant Hayes's words, that the letter had been posted locally, and Dorothy Craven's timid confession that Mrs. Bartlett had appeared frightened after reading it. Fear, Miss Marple knew, rarely visited the innocent without reason. A soft knock came at her door, hesitant but quick, as though made by someone who might change their mind at any moment. When she opened it, Dorothy stood there, drenched by the mist, her hair clinging to her cheeks. "I'm so sorry for calling so late," she stammered, "but I didn't know who else to go to." Miss Marple stepped aside at once. "Come in, my dear. Sit by the fire. You look as though you've seen a ghost." Dorothy shook her head, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "I was walking back from the vicarage. I'd gone to drop off some wool Mrs. Clement wanted, and when I passed Mrs. Bartlett's cottage, I saw a light inside. Only, there isn't supposed to be one, is there? The police locked it up." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "A light, you say? Are you certain?" Dorothy nodded quickly. "Yes, a flickering one, like a lantern. I didn't stop to look long. It frightened me, but I thought I should tell someone." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the clock. It was nearly 9. She rose, fetched her shawl, and gave Dorothy a reassuring smile. "You did quite right, my dear. But if there's truly a light, it ought to be seen to before it's extinguished. Would you be brave enough to walk with me as far as the lane?" Dorothy hesitated, then nodded. Together they set out into the fog. The road was quiet, their footsteps soft on the damp ground. When they reached the turn toward Mill Lane, Miss Marple bade her stop. "You wait here, child. I'll only go as far as the gate." The cottage stood dimly outlined against the fog, the ivy on its walls wet and heavy. Miss Marple approached slowly, careful not to let her shoes crunch on the gravel. Through the small sitting-room window she saw, just as Dorothy had said, a faint light, not a lantern, but the dull, wavering glow of a candle. Someone was inside, then it vanished. She stood still for a long moment, listening. The air carried no sound save the occasional drip of rain from the eaves. Finally, she turned back toward Dorothy, who waited like a pale wisp of shadow at the bend. "There was a light," Miss Marple said quietly, "and now there isn't." Dorothy clutched her sleeve. "Do you think someone broke in?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps someone felt they had forgotten something." The next morning, the village awoke to the news that the constable on duty at the cottage had fallen ill during the night and been taken home. No one had been stationed there for several hours. Sergeant Hayes was furious and red-faced about it, though he tried to hide his agitation when Miss Marple arrived at the gate after breakfast. "You've heard, then," he said, rubbing his chin. "We're checking to see if anything's been disturbed." "Has it?" she asked. He sighed. "Not much. Just one odd thing. A teacup missing from the set on the table. The one she used?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. "Ah, and was it the cup itself or the saucer, too?" "The cup only." "Why, does that mean something?" "It often does," she replied mildly. "People don't take half of something unless they mean to hide a particular part. A saucer is unimportant. A cup, however, might hold traces." Hayes stared at her, then nodded slowly. "So you think whoever came last night—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that whoever came last night was looking for something specific, perhaps to remove what might condemn them." She turned her gaze toward the cottage, its door now wide open, a constable pacing the threshold. And it wasn't theft, she added softly. No one risks returning to the scene of a murder for silver spoons. By afternoon, word had spread that the missing cup was nowhere to be found. The police were combing the hedgerows, though Miss Marple suspected it had already been smashed or buried before dawn. She returned home quietly, her mind tracing the pattern again. The letter, the tea, the fear, the missing cup. All threads led back to one truth. Mrs. Bartlett had trusted someone she should not have trusted, and that trust had killed her. Late in the day, as she was watering her roses, she saw Sergeant Hayes approaching, his expression one of reluctant respect. "Miss Marple," he said, "we found something else, in her letterbox." Must have slipped behind the flap. Another envelope, unopened, addressed to her, but no sender again. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured, drying her hands on her apron. "When was it delivered, do you suppose?" "Yesterday, according to the postmark, after she'd already died." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the small detail like a cat watching the movement of a thread. "After her death," she repeated softly. "So whoever sent the first letter wished her silence, and whoever sent the second wished her absence explained." She looked toward the mist rising again from the fields, her expression serene but her voice low with certainty. "Sergeant, I believe you'll find that whoever wrote those letters is not far from the knitting circle, nor from this village. Murder, you see, never travels as far as people think. It's always just down the lane." Hayes frowned. "And what should we do then?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, returning to her roses. "Why, nothing rash, my dear Sergeant. We shall let people talk a little longer. They always do. And in their talking, someone will mend one too many details. And when they do, I'll know which pair of hands wound this particular thread." The light faded slowly over St. Mary Mead, leaving the air heavy with quiet expectancy. And somewhere, behind drawn curtains and whispered prayers, a single guilty conscience began to stir uneasily, aware that Miss Marple was already watching, quietly unraveling the truth one stitch at a time. The next morning brought with it a thin, watery sunlight that made the damp hedges glisten like silver thread. St. Mary Mead had resumed its deceptive calm, though beneath the quiet, the murder still pulsed faintly through every conversation. The postmistress had already refused to handle any unlabeled envelopes. Mrs. Bantry had decided she might invest in a new lock for her pantry, just in case. And Colonel Melchett had declared to anyone who'd listened that women's nerves were ruining the village's sense of proportion. Miss Marple, who heard all this while purchasing scones at the bakery, merely smiled and said she supposed human nature was much the same, whether in war or peace. Only the weapons differed. By mid-morning she was on her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Clement, a sensible man with a fondness for puzzles, had offered to show her the copy of the letters that Sergeant Hayes had allowed him to see. The vicar's study was warm, filled with the scent of tobacco and paper. He greeted her with his usual good humor. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "I've just been puzzling over this business of the letters. Would you believe they're written in two entirely different hands?" Miss Marple's expression brightened, though she only nodded politely. "Oh, that is interesting. Different, you say? Not disguised?" "Distinctly so. One neat and small, the other slanted and hurried. The first was found opened on Mrs. Bartlett's table, the second unopened in her letterbox." She accepted the offered sheets, her eyes moving across the paper slowly. The first was polite but strangely cold, a note of warning couched in careful civility. Certain matters are best left undisturbed. The past is better buried. The second was briefer, almost taunting. "And now you know the cost of curiosity." Miss Marple laid them side by side on the vicar's desk, her fingers resting lightly on the corners. "Yes," she murmured, "two hands, but one mind." The phrasing gives it away. Whoever wrote these wanted to seem different, and yet could not resist their own rhythm. The same sort of vanity, you know, that compels an actor to bow even after a disguise. The vicar watched her with interest. You think they were written by the same person? I'd wager my knitting needles on it, she replied. But what's more curious is the timing. The first arrived before her death, the second after. Someone wanted to frighten her into silence, and then, having succeeded, wished to make it appear inevitable. Clement frowned. You think she knew something, then? Oh, undoubtedly, said Miss Marple softly. But perhaps not something new. Mrs. Bartlett was a woman of steady habits and tidy conscience. Such people do not attract scandal unless it comes looking for them. No, I suspect the matter concerned something old, something she thought safely put to rest. As she left the vicarage, she saw Sergeant Hayes approaching along the lane, his stride brisk but his face troubled. He tipped his cap. Ah, Miss Marple, I was just coming to see you. There's been a development. The postmistress remembered something peculiar. Said the first letter, the one found on Mrs. Bartlett's table, wasn't delivered by post at all. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. Indeed. She says Mrs. Bartlett collected it herself from the counter, told her she'd been expecting it, but there was no address written on it, only her name, nothing else. Postmistress thought it strange, but she didn't ask questions. That was wise, Miss Marple murmured. Curiosity in St. Mary Mead can sometimes prove quite fatal. Hayes gave a rueful laugh. So she must have known who sent it then. Yes, said Miss Marple quietly. And she was afraid. That's why she drank her tea so quickly she didn't notice the bitterness. Fear dulls the tongue, Sergeant. He frowned. You think the poison was already waiting in the cup? Or in the sugar, she replied. A gift, perhaps. Something familiar enough not to be questioned. We trust the things that come from friends. She looked down the lane where the mist still clung in pockets of pale smoke. Tell me, Sergeant, has anyone mentioned a gift recently? A small parcel, perhaps. Something she received before her death. Hayes scratched his chin. Now that you mention it, Mrs. Price Ridley did say she'd seen a tin on the kitchen counter. One of those fancy types, floral with a ribbon. Thought it was biscuits, but it wasn't there when we searched. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. Not biscuits, I think. Tea, most likely. And I shouldn't be surprised if it came from someone she once trusted, someone who attended the knitting circle. Hayes stiffened. You mean one of the ladies? She smiled faintly. One always does, Sergeant. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Price Ridley, ostensibly to return a borrowed magazine. The woman was, as always, briskly alert to anything resembling news. When Miss Marple mentioned the tin, Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward eagerly. Oh yes, I saw it with my own eyes. Pale green tied with a bit of ribbon. Said it was a gift from someone at the circle, but she wouldn't say who. She was funny about it, closed the lid right away when I looked. I thought she was just being particular. Miss Marple nodded. And when was this? Why, the day before she died. Morning, I think. Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful. As she walked home, Miss Marple felt the final threads beginning to align. A gift of tea, a letter warning against curiosity, fear that turned to silence, and now a missing cup, one that someone had risked much to remove. It was all of a piece, like a pattern emerging slowly from a tangled skein. When she reached her garden gate, she paused to look back at the distant line of cottages, the afternoon sunlight glinting off their windows. It was all so peaceful. Too peaceful, she thought. She had seen this kind of stillness before, the hush that falls when guilt is trying very hard to appear normal. Somewhere among those houses sat a woman, perhaps pouring herself tea, perhaps glancing too often toward her window, who had thought she could tidy away murder as easily as crumbs from a tablecloth. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. "Oh, my dear," she murmured under her breath. "You've hidden your cup, but you can't hide your conscience, and sooner or later, one of your stitches will slip." She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her, and reached for her knitting. The pattern was nearly finished now, and so, she suspected, was the game. That evening, a restless wind swept through St. Mary Mead, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the faint scent of rain and wood smoke. Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair, her knitting untouched on her lap. She had been thinking, not in the hurried, excited manner of policemen chasing clues, but in that slow, deliberate way that often brought her closer to the truth than anyone else. It was always the small, unremarkable details that mattered most: the cup missing from the saucer, the letter with no address, the ribbon-tied tin that had vanished. A knock sounded on her door. Light, hesitant. She knew who it was even before she opened it. Sergeant Hayes stood on her step, cap in hand, his face drawn with fatigue and something more: confusion. "I shouldn't bother you so late, Miss Marple," he began, "but I've run into a puzzle I can't make head or tail of." She smiled mildly. "Puzzles, Sergeant, are rather my specialty. Do come in." He took the chair opposite her, glancing around at the tidy room, the ticking clock, the faint scent of lavender. "It's about Mrs. Bartlett's post," he said finally. "We checked again with the post office records. There were 2 deliveries that day, morning and late afternoon. But here's the strange part. The second letter, the one found after her death, was dropped through her door between 5 and 6. According to the doctor, she'd already been dead an hour by then." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "So the letter wasn't meant for her to read, but for someone else to find. That's quite telling, don't you think?" Hayes frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning the sender wanted to direct suspicion," she said softly. "And when one wants to direct suspicion, one must be careful where the finger points." Hayes rubbed his chin, thinking. "You think the second letter was planted?" "Almost certainly. And more so, I suspect it was meant to be found, to seem like a cruel message from some distant enemy. But Mrs. Bartlett's enemies, Sergeant, are not distant. They live within walking distance of the post office." He sighed. "That doesn't narrow it down much in this village." "Oh, but it does," she said. Her tone as gentle as ever. Mrs. Bartlett was a woman of modest means, but she had something others envied: the trust of many and the knowledge of more. She kept her neighbors' confidences, their little indiscretions, and that sort of knowledge, in a small place like this, can be far more dangerous than wealth. Hayes sat back, the weight of that truth settling on him. "You think someone feared what she knew?" "Or feared that she might tell it," Miss Marple murmured. "You see, fear and guilt are very close companions. The letter, the gift, the tea, all attempts to quiet her before she spoke." The sergeant was silent for a long moment, staring into the hearth. "There's something else," he said finally. "We dusted the tin we found behind her shed this morning. Same green one Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned. But there's only one set of fingerprints on it. Mrs. Bartlett's." "How neat of them," Miss Marple said softly. "Too neat, in fact. A tidy criminal is always a careless one." "Meaning?" "Meaning they wiped it clean before placing it there, forgetting that Mrs. Bartlett would naturally handle it herself afterward." Hayes stared at her, the realization dawning slowly. "So whoever gave it to her must have worn gloves." "Precisely. And gloves, my dear Sergeant, are quite out of place at a knitting circle." The clock struck 9, the chime soft and deliberate. Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains, her voice almost a whisper. "Tomorrow, when you speak with the ladies again, you might notice who avoids looking at the teapot. Guilt rarely hides in words. It hides in small gestures. Watch who refuses the offer of tea." Hayes nodded slowly, standing to leave. "You're certain it was one of them?" She turned toward him, her expression serene but her eyes sharp. "Certain enough to knit the last row, Sergeant. But one doesn't pull the final thread too soon. It must tighten itself." He left her then, stepping out into the night, his lantern cutting a pale circle through the fog. Miss Marple lingered by the window long after he'd gone, her reflection faint against the glass. The pattern was clear now. Not of wool, but of human frailty. A woman silenced by fear, another trembling under the weight of her own deceit, and somewhere, in one of those neatly kept cottages where the lamp still glowed and the curtains were drawn just a little too tightly, someone's composure was beginning to unravel. Miss Marple could almost hear it. The soft, invisible sound of guilt stitching itself into panic. She returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and began again from the row she'd left unfinished, her fingers steady, her mind quietly certain that before the last stitch was complete, the truth would come knocking, as it always did. The next morning dawned grey and still, the kind of morning that seemed to muffle even the birds. The village looked ordinary enough. Smoke curling from chimneys, milk bottles clinking on doorsteps. But there was a tension beneath it, a quiet tightening that Miss Marple could almost feel in the air. People were avoiding one another's eyes now, and those who did stop to speak kept their voices low, as though the very hedgerows might be listening. Miss Marple herself was out early, walking toward the parish hall where the knitting circle had resumed its meetings, if only out of stubborn habit. The sign had been turned up bright again. Thursday knitting circle, 10 a.m., though the handwriting seemed less confident than before. Inside, the women were gathered as usual, but the air was heavy, the chatter forced. A few chairs remained empty. Mrs. Bantry sat by the window, fanning herself with a pattern sheet, while Mrs. Price Ridley watched the door like a cat expecting company. Dorothy Craven sat quietly in the corner, her needles motionless in her lap. Miss Marple entered with her usual soft smile, and a pleasant "Good morning." A few murmured replies followed, and the sound of knitting resumed. The click of needles like tiny heartbeats in the strained silence. She took her seat near Dorothy and began to work her own piece, though her eyes moved steadily between the faces around her. It was a curious thing, she thought, how people behaved under the weight of suspicion. Some overcompensated, smiling too brightly, laughing too quickly. Others grew still, as though silence itself might make them invisible. Mrs. Price Ridley broke the silence first. "I suppose the police will be stopping by again today," she said in a tone that suggested she both dreaded and hoped for it. "Sergeant Hayes has been dreadfully busy. So thorough, I dare say the murderer won't get far." The word murderer landed like a pebble in a pond, small but rippling. Dorothy flinched visibly, her fingers tightening on the wool. Miss Marple, without looking up, said gently, "Oh, I'm quite sure the sergeant will have everything in hand. These things do take time, you know. Patience is what brings clarity, in knitting and in life." Mrs. Bantry chuckled weakly. "Trust you to find a moral in the middle of murder, Miss Marple." "Not a moral, dear," she said mildly. "Just a habit of observation." It was then that the door opened, and Sergeant Hayes stepped inside, hat in hand. The chatter ceased at once. He greeted them politely, though his eyes lingered briefly on the group as if measuring the air. "Ladies," he began, "I'm sorry to intrude again, but I have a few more questions. Purely routine, you understand." No one spoke. He went on, glancing at his notebook. "It seems Mrs. Bartlett received a small tin of tea shortly before her death. We're just confirming who might have given it to her. Nothing alarming." Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "I never saw such a tin. Perhaps a friend from town." "Possibly," said Hayes, "though we've reason to think it came from her. A gift from one of you ladies, perhaps. She mentioned it at the grocer's." There was a pause, brief but noticeable. Dorothy's head dropped lower. Miss Marple's eyes, still fixed on her knitting, caught the movement, the trembling of the yarn as it slipped unevenly through the girl's fingers. Hayes noticed it too. "Miss Craven," he said gently, "I don't suppose you recall anyone bringing her tea, do you?" Dorothy's voice came out thin, almost childlike. "No. I mean, I might have. She liked her tea, everyone knew that. But I didn't." She stopped, breath catching as though the air itself had turned against her. The others shifted in their chairs. Mrs. Price Ridley's lips parted, ready to speak, but Miss Marple's soft voice cut across the room before she could. "Dorothy, dear," she said kindly, "when you went to Mrs. Bartlett's that morning with the wool, you saw the tin, didn't you? On her table." Dorothy nodded, wordless. "And it was already open." A tear slid down the girl's cheek. "Yes, she said it was from me. She thought it was sweet of me to bring it, but I never did. I never—" Hayes leaned forward. "You mean someone else brought it and said it was from you?" Dorothy nodded again, trembling. A parcel was delivered to her house. No note, just the tin. She thought I'd left it for her, but I didn't even know. Miss Marple set her needles down quietly. "How cruelly clever," she murmured, "to make kindness itself the disguise." The room was utterly still. Hayes's pen hovered over his notebook. "Do you know who might have told her that, Dorothy?" The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Mrs. Hewitt. She said she'd seen me carrying it. I told her she must be mistaken, but she laughed and said I was being modest." Mrs. Bantry gasped, and a flurry of whispers followed, but Hayes raised a hand for silence. "Mrs. Hewitt isn't here today, is she?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "She isn't. She told me only yesterday she had a dreadful cold," though her voice on the telephone sounded perfectly clear. Hayes closed his notebook with quiet finality. "Then I'll have a word with her." Miss Marple's voice stopped him gently. "Sergeant, you might also look in her kitchen cupboard. If I'm not mistaken, you'll find a second tin. Empty, and a pair of gloves still faintly scented with bergamot." The women stared at her, wide-eyed as Hayes blinked in, astonishment. "You already know, then?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I suspected. Mrs. Hewitt always prided herself on her tea blends, a harmless hobby except when paired with resentment. You see, Mrs. Bartlett once told her she'd been spreading tales about the vicar's wife. Mrs. Hewitt hated being corrected. In her way, she wanted to prove she wasn't to be trifled with. Poison can seem a small, tidy revenge to a tidy mind." Hayes nodded slowly, half awed, half grim. "And the letter?" "Oh, that was hers too," Miss Marple said, her tone almost sad. "Written with her left hand to confuse you. Vanity again." But she forgot the rhythm of her own words. The knitting circle sat frozen in silence as the truth settled, heavy and irreversible. The teacups on the table seemed to gleam unnaturally bright, each one a reminder of how fragile ordinary things could be. Miss Marple resumed her knitting at last, her voice quiet but firm. "You see, my dears, evil rarely arrives with a scream. It slips quietly between stitches, hidden in the smallest acts, and like a dropped stitch, it always unravels, sooner or later." Outside, the wind had died, and sunlight filtered faintly through the windows of the parish hall. In that stillness, St. Mary Mead felt almost peaceful again, but beneath its calm, Miss Marple knew, the memory of a single poisoned cup would linger far longer than any rumor. The day after Sergeant Hayes's visit to Mrs. Hewitt's cottage, St. Mary Mead awoke under a sky that seemed washed clean, pale and innocent, as if it wished to erase the stain of what had happened. But Miss Marple knew better. Evil in a village like this didn't vanish with the morning light. It lingered, tucked neatly behind lace curtains and polite nods, waiting to be forgotten. She sat by her garden window, pouring tea with her usual grace. The news had spread quickly, of course. Mrs. Hewitt had been taken in for questioning, though Hayes had refrained from using the word arrest. A woman like her, refined, respected, perfectly turned out, couldn't possibly be treated like a criminal in public. Not yet, anyway. Miss Marple had expected as much. It was never the rough or desperate who disturbed the peace in places like St. Mary Mead. It was always the tidy souls, the ones who prided themselves on order and good taste. They killed not for passion, but for the quiet satisfaction of restoring their version of propriety. A faint knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Sergeant Hayes stood there once again, looking older than he had a week ago. "May I?" he asked. "Of course, Sergeant," Miss Marple said, stepping aside. "You look as though you've been up all night." "I have," he admitted, taking off his cap. "We've been going through Mrs. Hewitt's things. You were right about the tin. We found traces of cyanide dust inside, and gloves in her pantry drawer, just where you said. But there's something else, something odd." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea, watching him over the rim of the pot. "Odd, you say?" "She's denying everything, of course," he continued. "Claims the tea was part of a charity parcel she'd been assembling. Says she's no idea how poison got into it. And the thing is, she sounds believable. Calm as you like." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, she would be. You see, Sergeant, Mrs. Hewitt's great strength and her great weakness is her belief in her own innocence. I doubt she thinks of herself as a murderer at all." Hayes frowned. "How could she not?" "Because in her mind," Miss Marple said gently, "she was correcting a mistake, setting things right. You remember Mrs. Bartlett's letter, the one that warned her to leave the past buried? Mrs. Bartlett knew something that could have unstitched the pattern Mrs. Hewitt had spent years knitting for herself." He stared at her. "And what was that?" Miss Marple set down her cup. "Years ago, Mrs. Hewitt's husband was not quite the pillar of respectability she liked to suggest. There was a small matter of money missing from the parish accounts, and Mrs. Bartlett, then church secretary, was the only one who noticed. She never exposed him, of course. She was far too kind for that. But she mentioned it to her closest friend, thinking it long forgotten, and Mrs. Hewitt overheard." Hayes ran a hand through his hair. "So you think this was revenge? After all this time?" "Not revenge," Miss Marple said softly. "Fear. She believed Mrs. Bartlett might speak. That's what the letter meant, the warning to let sleeping dogs lie. But poor Mrs. Bartlett was too decent to understand how dangerous truth can seem to the fearful." He exhaled slowly, staring into the fire. "I suppose that explains everything." "Almost," Miss Marple murmured, "but not quite." Hayes looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple rose, walking to the window. The garden outside was bright, the roses climbing lazily along the trellis. "There's still the matter of who helped her," she said quietly. "Mrs. Hewitt may have mixed the poison, but someone had to deliver it. And if you recall, she was seen at the time of the posting, attending a parish meeting." Hayes frowned, his notebook forgotten. "Then who?" "Dorothy Craven," Miss Marple said, turning back toward him. Her voice was not accusing, merely sad. The poor child. Too frightened to question, too loyal to refuse. Mrs. Hewitt likely told her it was a gift, asked her to drop it by the cottage, perhaps even praised her helpfulness. Dorothy never suspected until afterward. That's why she was pale at the knitting circle. She knew she'd carried something dreadful, though she didn't yet know what. Hayes stood in silence for a long moment. "So you'd say she was an accomplice?" Miss Marple shook her head. "A tool, Sergeant. The kind. Innocence is always the easiest to use. Mrs. Hewitt chose her precisely because she would never think to look inside the tin." Outside, the church bell began to toll 11. Miss Marple refilled the teapot, her movements calm and unhurried. "You see, Sergeant, the tragedy of murder in a village like ours is not its cruelty, but its familiarity. It doesn't come from strangers, it comes from tea tables and polite smiles, from women who cannot bear to be thought small. Hayes nodded slowly, his voice low. And now it's finished. Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes remained distant. Yes, finished, as much as anything ever is. But there will be whispers for months, and pity for Dorothy, poor soul. Evil leaves its mark, even when it's tidy. He left a few minutes later, and Miss Marple stood at the window once more, watching him walk down the lane. The village was quiet again, its order restored, its peace reassembled like china glued back together after a fall. She sighed, sat down, and took up her knitting. The pattern was complete now, every thread in place, every loose end tied. And yet, as the clock ticked softly on the mantelpiece, she could not help but think that somewhere, in some other cottage, another kettle was beginning to boil, and another secret was waiting for its moment to spill. She smiled faintly to herself, as if to an old companion. "It never really ends, does it?" she whispered. Then she bent to her knitting again, her needles whispering in steady rhythm, as the quiet village of St. Mary Mead settled once more into its deceptive calm. 2 days later, the village appeared almost itself again. Curtains fluttered open, gossip resumed its usual hum, and the church bells tolled with innocent regularity. Yet beneath the surface of this returning calm, the undercurrent of unease persisted, like the faint scent of smoke long after the fire had been extinguished. St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple thought, always prided itself on recovery, but memory in small villages was a tenacious thing. It lingered, stitched quietly into the corners of conversation. Sergeant Hayes stopped by in the afternoon. He looked more relaxed than before, his manner lighter, though there was a certain thoughtfulness about his eyes. "We've finished the questioning, Miss Marple," he said, taking off his cap as he stepped into her little sitting room. "Mrs. Hewitt confessed early this morning. Everything you said was exactly right, down to the last detail. She admits she asked Dorothy to drop off the tin, saying it was a surprise for Mrs. Bartlett. Said she'd wanted to frighten her into keeping quiet, but hadn't meant for her to die. A likely story, but I suppose she half believes it." Miss Marple gave a small sigh and poured him tea. "They always do, Sergeant. It's one of the most dreadful parts of such cases. The self-deception. People convince themselves that their motives are pure, even as they stir the sugar into another's death." Hayes accepted the cup gratefully. "It's strange, though. She cried more over Dorothy than anything else. Said she never meant to hurt the girl." "She didn't have to mean it," Miss Marple said softly. "Goodness rarely protects the innocent when it's blind. Poor Dorothy's life won't be the same. Fear leaves a shadow, you know. It doesn't pass when the case is over." They sat for a moment in companionable silence, the sound of the clock steady against the quiet room. Outside, a robin hopped along the garden wall, its red breast bright against the grey afternoon. "I've been meaning to ask," Hayes said finally. "How did you know it was her and not one of the others? There were so many little hints. Letters, the tea, the missing cup. But what gave her away?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes drifting toward the window. "Oh, it was her voice, Sergeant. When she spoke of Mrs. Bartlett the day after her death, she said, 'Poor woman, she should have left well enough alone.' It wasn't grief or shock in her tone, it was irritation, and irritation is a curiously revealing thing. People can mask fear and sorrow, but not that small human impatience when their tidy world is disturbed." Hayes chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You notice everything, don't you?" "Not everything," she said modestly. "Only what others overlook because they're busy looking too hard. The truth is usually rather simple. It only hides beneath politeness." He finished his tea and stood. "Well, I can't thank you enough. Without your insight, we'd still be chasing theories about mysterious letters from strangers." Miss Marple's smile deepened slightly. "Mystery, Sergeant, rarely comes from strangers. It's a domestic creature. It likes to live close to home." When he'd gone, she tidied away the cups and stood for a long while by the window, watching the evening gather over the village. In the distance, Dorothy Craven walked slowly along the path by the vicarage, her head bent, a basket in her arms. Miss Marple's heart softened at the sight. She would invite the girl to tea in a few days' time, perhaps help her find work again. Healing, she knew, required ordinary kindness more than sermons or pity. As dusk thickened, she returned to her chair, took up her knitting, and resumed her pattern. The wool moved gently through her fingers, steady and certain. Outside, the lamps were being lit one by one, the faint yellow glow spilling into the dark, like hope in small, deliberate stitches. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Another secret untangled, another quiet evil laid to rest. Yet she knew the peace would not last. It never did. Not in human hearts, not in tidy villages. Somewhere, someone was already telling a story, half true, half wrong, setting in motion the first faint tremor of the next mystery to come. And so she knitted, the rhythm of the needles keeping time with her thoughts, the threads crossing and looping as neatly as the lives she so often saw unravel. A thin mist had rolled over St. Mary Mead by the time evening came, softening the outlines of the cottages and making the gas lamps flicker with an almost thoughtful glow. It was quiet again, too quiet, Miss Marple thought, as she moved about her small sitting room, putting away her teacup and tidying the lace on the armchair as though restoring the village's sense of order, one domestic gesture at a time. Yet beneath the calm hum of the clock she could feel the faint vibration of unrest still alive in the air, the way a wound throbs even after the bleeding stops. Dorothy Craven had come by that morning. The poor girl had stood awkwardly on the threshold, hands clenched together, her eyes rimmed red, but her manner strangely composed. She had thanked Miss Marple for her kindness, for seeing the truth, as she'd called it. Yet what struck Miss Marple most was not Dorothy's grief, but the quiet maturity in her tone. There was no resentment, only the dull ache of someone who had looked directly at evil and been changed by it. After Dorothy had gone, Miss Marple had sat for a long time, staring at the untouched slice of cake she had set out for her. Some tragedies, she thought, did not end even when the culprit was found. They rippled outward, touching everyone, staining even the innocent with a sort of invisible sorrow. That thought was still in her mind when there came another knock on the door, lighter this time, almost hesitant. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, looking flustered but polite as ever. "My dear Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "I've just come from the post office. There's talk again about the letters." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the letters never quite lose their charm, do they?" Mrs. Clement leaned closer, lowering her voice as though the very wallpaper might be listening. "They say another one has turned up, addressed to Mrs. Hewitt this time, of all people. Arrived this afternoon, hand-delivered. Sergeant Hayes is quite beside himself." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. "Another letter?" "Yes. But this one's odd. It's unsigned and there's no threat in it. Just one sentence. Justice is never finished, only delayed. Rather theatrical, don't you think?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes sharpened with thought. "Theatrical, yes. But also telling. Guilt, Mrs. Clement, is a playwright with an unending script." The vicar's wife blinked, clearly uncertain whether to be comforted or alarmed. "Do you suppose it means anything dreadful? Surely not another scandal?" "Scandal is simply truth dressed for company," Miss Marple said gently. "But I don't believe this is new mischief. It sounds more like conscience. Someone, perhaps not Mrs. Hewitt, is finding it difficult to sleep." Mrs. Clement gave a nervous laugh. "Well, if that's so, I hope they find their peace before the parish meeting tomorrow. We can't have another upset, not with the new flower fund to be voted on." When she had gone, Miss Marple stood for a while by the window, her reflection pale against the glass. The mist had thickened, The lamps along the high street glowed like suspended pearls in the gloom. Another letter. She could almost see the village beginning to hum again, curiosity flickering back to life where fear had barely cooled. And yet something about it troubled her. Later that evening, Sergeant Hayes returned once more, carrying the letter in a small envelope bag. He placed it on her table without a word. She examined it carefully. Handwritten, yes, but not in Mrs. Hewitt's style. The paper was the same cheap stock used for the earlier letters, but the ink slightly different, darker, as though written with deliberation. "Not her hand," Hayes muttered. "And she's been in custody since morning. We've checked every visitor." Miss Marple looked up at him, her eyes clear and calm. "Then you must ask yourself, Sergeant, who benefits from reminding the village that evil lingers? Some people thrive on the echo of scandal. It makes them feel important again." Hayes frowned. "You think it's just gossip dressed up as mystery?" She smiled, shaking her head. "Not gossip. Habit. People miss the excitement once it's gone. When peace returns, they invent shadows to fill the silence." He nodded slowly. "So no new danger, then?" "Oh, there's always danger," she said softly, "but not always from murder. Sometimes it's from the stories we tell afterward, the ones that keep fear alive." After he left, she folded the letter neatly, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it beside the lamp. The flame flickered over the words. "Justice is never finished, only delayed." She whispered to herself, "How very true." Outside, the mist swallowed the last trace of light, and St. Mary Mead lay in quiet darkness once more. Yet in one cottage window, a faint glow remained, a solitary figure knitting beneath the soft hum of thought, her needles tracing, stitch by patient stitch, the endless, delicate pattern of human nature. The following morning brought a curious tension to St. Mary Mead, one that Miss Marple sensed even before she left her doorstep. The postmistress was standing by the corner shop, speaking in low tones to the milkman, and a group of children had gathered near the green, whispering and pointing toward the church. It wasn't the frightened gossip of the week before. This had a different quality, something between excitement and disbelief. As Miss Marple made her way along the lane, Mrs. Bantry caught sight of her from her gate and hurried over, bonnet askew and cheeks pink from both the cold and the thrill of fresh news. "My dear Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "you've heard, I suppose. There's been another letter." Miss Marple paused, expression mild. "Another? My, how industrious our mysterious correspondent seems to be." "Oh, this one's quite different," Mrs. Bantry went on, leaning in. "It wasn't sent to anyone in particular, simply pinned to the church notice board. Can you imagine, right there beside the announcement for the Harvest Festival?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "What a dreadful choice of placement. What did it say?" Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, though half the village could still hear. "It said, 'Forgiveness may quiet the guilty, but it never deceives the dead.' Signed with nothing at all. The vicar found it early this morning." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her thoughts moved quickly. Another note. Public this time, dramatic, meant to stir. It did not have the intimacy of guilt, but the performance of it. Someone, she thought, was trying to keep the fire burning now that the truth had cooled. "Has the sergeant been informed?" she asked. "Oh, yes. He's furious, of course. Says he'll have the paper examined again. But between you and me, I think it's just someone craving a little excitement. After all, we've had so much of it lately, haven't we?" Miss Marple only smiled, thanked her, and continued toward the church. The morning light slanted across the cobblestones, and the faint chill of autumn hung in the air. When she reached the notice board, the letter had already been removed, but she could see the pin still stuck in the wood, bent at an angle, as if inserted in haste. The vicar emerged from the vestry just then, a look of mild distress on his kind face. "I don't know what to make of it, Miss Marple. The handwriting matches the earlier ones, or nearly does. Sergeant Hayes believes it's an imitation. An imitation, yes, she murmured, studying the pin, but not a random one. I think this was meant less as a threat and more as a statement. Whoever wrote it wanted to rewrite the story, to keep Mrs. Hewitt's guilt alive in memory, or perhaps to cloud it. The vicar frowned. But why on earth would anyone wish to do that? Miss Marple looked up at him gently. Because, Reverend, in every tragedy there is always someone who profits from confusion, someone who feels more important when others whisper. As they spoke, the faint sound of hurried footsteps came down the lane. Sergeant Hayes, his coat unbuttoned, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, catching his breath, "I hoped I'd find you here. You'll want to hear this. We've discovered something rather odd about Mrs. Hewitt's confession." Her brows lifted slightly. "Odd?" He nodded. "A piece of it doesn't add up. She claimed she bought the cyanide years ago, kept it from when her husband was clearing pests in the garden. But we've traced the bottle. It was purchased recently, only 3 weeks before the murder. And it wasn't bought in Market Down, as she said. It came from the chemist, here, in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's expression barely changed, but there was a glint of thought behind her calm. "Indeed. And who, pray, purchased it?" "That's the trouble," Hayes said. "The register shows no entry under her name, or anyone of her address. The chemist insists it was bought by a woman, well-dressed, polite, said she needed it for weeds along the wall. Signed herself as Mrs. Barton. No one by that name lives in the village." Miss Marple folded her hands lightly, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Mrs. Barton, how very convenient, and how very unimaginative. You think it's a false name?" "I think," she said softly, "that someone else wanted to make sure Mrs. Hewitt had what she needed. Someone clever enough to stay invisible. Tell me, Sergeant, was Mrs. Hewitt's husband ever much of a gardener?" Hayes blinked. "Gardener? No, not that I recall. Why?" Miss Marple turned toward the churchyard wall, where ivy had begun to creep over the stones. "Because the phrase, 'weeds along the wall,' that sounds less like a reason and more like a message. A memory, perhaps, passed quietly between two people who thought no one else would notice. But of course, one always does." Hayes looked puzzled. "You mean there's another person involved?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I should say another conscience involved, yes. Someone who watched, who perhaps nudged the pieces but let another hand move them. Mrs. Hewitt may have held the cup, but she didn't fill it alone." The sergeant exhaled slowly, rubbing his chin. "You're thinking of an accomplice. Someone who wanted the same result, but let her take the blame." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant, thoughtful. "Precisely. Evil often walks in pairs, Sergeant. One who acts and one who quietly approves." The church bell tolled the hour, echoing through the misty air. She looked toward the row of cottages beyond the green, their chimneys puffing faintly. "And if I am right," she added quietly, "our other player has just realized that guilt, once set loose, cannot be directed. It has a way of circling back home." Hayes met her gaze, uneasy. "Then you think there's still danger?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost kind. "Only to the one who thought the story was finished." The wind stirred the leaves at their feet, and somewhere in the distance a door shut softly, deliberately, as though someone, somewhere, had been listening all along. That evening, St. Mary Mead was wrapped in a damp hush, as though the mist itself were listening. The gas lamps flickered weakly against the rising fog, and the streets seemed narrower, quieter, as Miss Marple made her slow way home from the vicarage. She had gone there under the pretext of returning a borrowed book, though in truth she had wanted to observe the villagers on her walk. The subtle tension in their faces, the way curtains twitched a heartbeat too, quickly as she passed. The village, she thought, had begun to breathe uneasily again. When she reached her gate, a shadow detached itself from the hedge. Sergeant Hayes stepped forward, his boots muffled by the damp earth. "Forgive me for troubling you so late," he said. "But you were right. There's something more." Miss Marple gestured him inside with quiet composure. The lamps inside her sitting room glowed softly, the scent of lavender oil faint in the air. "Sit down, Sergeant," she said kindly. "You look as though you've been walking the length of the county." He removed his cap, shaking his head. "We found her, Miss Marple, the woman who bought the cyanide. Or at least, we think we have." Her knitting paused mid-stitch. "Ah," she murmured. "And who is our mysterious Mrs. Barton?" Hayes hesitated, lowering his voice. "It was Mrs. Price Ridley. The chemist recognized her straight away once I showed her photograph. Said she came in wearing gloves, veil and all. Claimed it was for her roses, if you please. We've just searched her house." Miss Marple set down her needles gently, as if the moment required respect. "How very foolish," she said softly. "And yet, so very like her." Hayes looked baffled. "Like her?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied. "She has always been one for appearances. Order, decency, the illusion of correctness. She would never poison a person herself, of course, but she might help along the process if she believed it was for the good of propriety." Hayes frowned. "You mean she helped Mrs. Hewitt?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, rising slowly, "that Mrs. Hewitt may never have thought to act at all without encouragement. Some women require a little moral justification, a whisper from a friend that such things can be done for the right reasons. And Mrs. Price Ridley, I dare say, provided just that. She's always been fond of tidy conclusions and of ensuring that others bear the burden of her ideas." Hayes ran a weary hand through his hair. "We found letters, too, notes between the two of them, all carefully destroyed except one, half burned in the grate. It mentioned finishing what was begun." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "Yes, that would be her phrase. She has a way of using moral language to disguise cruelty. It's a kind of vanity, Sergeant, the vanity of thinking one's motives purer than one's deeds." There was a pause, the clock ticking softly between them. Hayes exhaled, his voice low. "We'll have to bring her in for questioning." "I imagine you'll find her ready," Miss Marple said. "She will deny everything, of course, and very prettily, too. But the truth will unsettle her. It always does in the end." Hayes stood, reluctant but resolute. "I'll be off then. Thank you, Miss Marple. Again." After he left, the room seemed unusually still. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her thoughts weaving through the evening like threads of smoke. The pattern was complete now. Two women bound by jealousy, pride, and a single act of whispered persuasion. One had mixed the poison, the other had planted the thought. Both had sought control, and both had lost it. Outside, the fog deepened, wrapping the village in silence. Through the window, the church spire loomed faintly, its tip disappearing into the clouds. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then stopped. Miss Marple rose at last and drew the curtains. "It's always the same," she said softly to herself. "One conscience sows, another waters, and between them evil grows quite domestically." She returned to her chair and picked up her knitting once more, her fingers moving gently over the needles. The fire crackled, throwing small sparks into the air, and in that warm, tidy little room, so peaceful, so ordinary, the quiet rhythm of her work resumed, calm and steady, as though the world outside had never darkened at all.